Thanks very much, Jack, and hello everybody. Thank you so much for coming along to today's webinar on that subject that has continued to be a talking point in the payments world in recent years, open banking. And whether that is the CMA order in the UK, PSD2/3 now, the consumer data right in Australia, new possible rules in the US and Canada, and further afield as well, this topic has created new opportunities for businesses and consumers in a post-2008 world. At Vixio Regulatory Intelligence, it has never strayed far from our day-to-day work, whether that is new laws being updated on horizon scanning or news stories in our editorial coverage. And on that subject, I'd like to walk you through what we do at Vixio. So Vixio is a regulatory technology or RegTech company and a trusted source of independent, authoritative and actionable regulatory intelligence for compliance, regulatory, strategy and development professionals in highly regulated industries undergoing rapid and radical change. We deliver comprehensive, time-sensitive and actionable intelligence on payments and gambling compliance, covering more than 180 jurisdictions across the globe and organised by product or service type. And to tell you who I am Jimmie Franklin, and I work, as Jack said, as Senior Journalist at Vixio Payments Compliance. My role includes looking at some of those huge regulatory developments that are taking shape at the moment in the payments and crypto space. And in recent years, when it comes to open banking, I've been covering issues such as PSD2 and now the PSD3 and PSR in the EU, and the ongoing work of JROC in the UK as well. I'd now like to introduce you to our speakers. We have a bit of an FCA class reunion today. John, how about we start with you?
Thanks, Jimmy. Hi all, my name is John Gidla. I lead up the payments compliance function at Vixio. So that's responsible for all things payments compliance with regards to horizon scanning. We provide country reports and entry requirements for businesses. And then I've also got a supporting line in with Jimmy, so we work closely together.
Brilliant. And Nilixa?
Hi, thanks, Jimmy. Thanks for the invitation today. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nilixa Devlukia. I'm chair of the Open Finance Association, which is an industry body working across the UK and EU that represents the demand side of the open banking and open finance ecosystems.
Brilliant. And Kat?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kat Cloud. I'm the Principal Director of Open Banking Compliance for EMEA, and I work at Envestnet Yodlee. We are a global open banking and open finance provider, originally based out of the US, and then we made the expansion across the pond in 2008, and then further on to India and Australia shortly after that.
Brilliant. And last but not least, Jack?
Hey, I lead policy and research at Truelayer. We're an open banking payments company, founded in 2016. Prior to Truelayer, I was at the FCA for 5 years, working with John, Nilixa and Kat on implementing PSD2.
Brilliant. So yeah, before we get started, just going to remind everyone, please do engage a lot, because we do have quite a few experts here today in this field, and I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion. And to start us off, I think a really good place would be the EU and UK, because I think a lot of open banking stuff did kind of, across the world start in the UK and the EU with PSD2 or the CMA order. And I wonder, maybe a bit of a provocative question to start with, but do you think that open banking has been a success in the EU and UK? John, how about we start with you?
I guess from my perspective, I think open banking in the UK and the EU has been a success. I know it's probably a bit of a bold statement, but I'd like to think we're best in class in terms of what we're building out and what we continue to kind of look to expand and explore. I guess that's similarly echoed by other competent authorities kind of leaning in on the FCA and the EU in terms of learning what's gone well and what they could do better. But I think there's still a long journey to go in terms of evolving into the open finance perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nilixa, obviously you've kind of worked on both sides of the channel a bit when it comes to open banking. What do you think of what's happened so far with the UK and EU on this?
Just to build on what John said, I would say that in my view, open banking has been more successful in the UK. If you look at the stats, the latest OB stats show that we've now got 13% of consumers actively using open banking, either for payments or data. The increase for small businesses is higher than that, it's 18%. Whereas if you look at the markets across the EU, and then this varies on which report you look at, but it's anything between sort of 2 to maybe 7 or 8%, but in specific markets. So maybe the Netherlands, Spain, Italy, France. And I think partly that's been driven by the fact that we've had a centralised body, we've had centralised standards, and we do have a pretty key use case in the fact that we can now make our personal tax payments via open banking payments. And I know the HMR sort of publication recently, you know, we have a tax deadline at the end of Jan, said that it was up like 40%. So I would say that we've still got a little way to go. You know, 10% of the market or average, depending on who you speak to in the UK, is you know, not a large share of the market. But I think that we have the core foundations there to actually have a really vibrant open banking, and then in the longer term, open finance ecosystem.
Yeah, and beyond just HMRC, are there other use cases at the moment that are coming up for you with open banking in the UK?
Well, we've already got some variable recurring payments live in the market, and I think that's the key sort of use case at the moment, particularly for e-commerce. I think the challenge we have is that the open banking ecosystem has been built on single payments or single immediate payments, and you know, we need more than that. We need the variation. We need to do more within that ecosystem, and this is why we really need to move at pace to, one, you know, go through the recurring payments pilot that the PSR is talking about, move forward with our future entity, and actually move into the sort of open finance smart data space that we have coming with the CFIT work and the DPDI.
Absolutely. And I wonder at the moment, one of the things that I remember people saying quite a bit, at least a few years ago, was how much further ahead the UK was than other countries when it came to open banking work, partly because of the centralised system. But in recent years, I have heard a bit more from people in the market that they're starting to feel like, you know, perhaps we're running out of, I don't know, maybe there isn't quite the momentum there used to be from regulators, and things seem to be slowing down a bit in terms of direction. I wonder, is there a risk of the UK falling behind, and what should be done to prevent that happening? Kat, I don't know if you would be able to take that one.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a slight risk of the UK falling behind. I know that we've recently had, obviously JROC just published the report. We had the smart data roadmap that was published as well this month. So I think prior to those publications, we definitely were more at risk of falling behind, whereas now I think we're getting that momentum back. We're starting to see that both government and the regulators are trying to set out clear next steps. They're trying to work with the industry to push to that, getting to that, as Nilixa said, that open finance smart data world that I think everyone on this call and everyone joining in the audience is very ready and excited about. And I think that what we just need to keep doing is just keep pushing, keep trying to give that momentum, making sure, working with the regulators, having open dialogues. And then also I think we need to look at what's happening around the world to make sure that we are not falling behind. So looking at what's happening in the US, look at what's happening in Canada, what's happening in Australia, what's happening in APAC, and really taking those lessons and the things that they are doing, both from a government-led perspective as well as a market-led perspective, to better understand and make sure that as we are moving towards this smart data world, that we're doing it taking lessons learned from the UK, but also taking lessons learned globally from the rest of the world.
Jack, I don't know if you wanted to come in on that as well.
I mean, I think it'll take a while for the EU to catch up with the UK when it comes to open banking. You know, we had this real amazing alignment of two things with PSD2, which was the kind of legal underpinnings, and the CMA order, which really standardized the technology. So we got a real head start there, you know, and it bears out with the 16 million monthly open banking payments that we have, the 9 million users. So, you know, we're doing really well in the UK. we, are obviously coming into this period where actually Brexit is kicking in, and we're having to take ownership of our own policy when it comes to everything from financial services to agriculture. So it's, there's a lot for regulators to do, and there's a real need for the regulators to upskill and hold the pen again on the rules. And you see that with the FCA, taking a lot of the responsibility for implementing, the smart regulatory framework into the handbook. So all of this is going to take time, and then hopefully, there's going to be another alignment of the smart regulatory framework, the national payments vision, and that's going to get us back on track, and we're going to have real leadership again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I've definitely noticed with the payments vision was how much open banking was being talked up as a genuine alternative, and can offer of choice to consumers and to businesses. And beyond the EU and UK, obviously, I've noticed a lot more happening in other markets as well. Certainly last year, big news coming out of the US and also Canada, but then other jurisdictions as well, I believe, have been making some progress, such as the UAE and other jurisdictions in that region. I wonder, John, where do you think the biggest opportunities and challenges are for open banking and perhaps open finance worldwide at the moment?
So I think from my perspective, looking at business models, I think looking at open finance and where it could go, I think there's a real big opportunity for marketplaces to really support consumers in terms of making informed decisions, but benefiting from extrapolating data and seeing everything in one place from a consumer perspective and from a business perspective. It's a great way to support and build in terms of allowing customers to make informed decisions. I think the challenge with that will always be the trust factor. I think we've seen it in the UK, and we are going in the right direction, but it's always been kind of an area of, do I trust a third party, or do I trust this new entrant in the market for providing a service that could be invaluable going forward? And just to add to that, it definitely feels like some of the emerging markets are pushing to be front runners. Not too long ago, we were speaking to some colleagues over in the UAE, and the race is definitely on to be the fintech hub or open banking hub in that region.
Are there any other markets that stand out to you beyond the UAE for open banking at the moment?
Well, there's a lot of noise coming out from Singapore. They've just been making some amendments to their payment services regulations. They've always been making noise, I guess, from an open banking perspective. But I think it definitely is that's an area to kind of watch this space, and also taking on lessons learned from what the UK has done, so someone could evolve what we're doing.
I think, John.
Oh, sorry, Nilixa, carry on.
I think I've just come back from Asia, and what was really informative there was what is actually happening in the market and not what they call it. And I think that's where we maybe need to be a little bit more mindful of, we put labels on things, but actually if you look at the super apps in Asia, Grab, and the other providers, GoCheck, etc., in the Philippines, they are sharing data between the fintechs and the banks. Some of the fintechs are the ones that now provide the most account acquisition for the banks and deposits. Now, that is open finance. It's not called open finance, but that is exactly what they're doing. And so I think that, as I say, we need to maybe move away from some of these labels and actually look at the activity. I don't have the figures to hand, but they were quite astounding as to the payments that flow and the interaction between the fintech side of the market and the commercial banks, and the fact that the banks are now relying on the fintechs to actually provide quite a fair chunk of their customers because of the way that the ecosystem has evolved and that consumer-facing interaction that the fintechs have.
And I wonder, is there like a better relationship between fintechs and the banks in some of the jurisdictions that, or perhaps places that what you observed in Money 2020? Because I feel like in the EU and UK there still is a bit of friction when it comes to that relationship.
I wouldn't necessarily say that there's a better relationship. I think it's the way that the ecosystem has evolved means that providers have had to come to the table and think, how do we organize ourselves in order to, have commercial benefit from the market that's now evolving in our jurisdiction. And so it's been, I think, probably partly necessity rather than anything else. But I think the thing is that it is a real reality check when you go to these jurisdictions, and no one's calling it open banking or open finance, but that's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, and actually that's interesting, just to follow up on that. I feel like with sometimes it can be a bit of confusion with the different names. Are you noticing any other names for it being used, like in different jurisdictions at the moment, beyond just open banking and open finance? I know that it's called the consumer data right in Australia, but yeah, are there any other kind of things that it's being called?
No, I mean, those are the terms that generally, I mean, we could all think of names we might want to call it when it doesn't go well.
Fair enough. And in terms of the US and Canada as well, like I felt like I was covering that quite a lot last year, particularly what was going on with the CFPB. What kind of progress is being made up there? And is it the same kind of work as has happened with PSD2 and the CMA order, for example? I don't know who wants to take that.
I can definitely take that one. Yeah. I would say there's loads of work being done. We are still in a draft rule, so we are expecting to get the final rule in fall, more likely probably September timeline. I will say one thing that the CFPB did and that they were very honest about was they took lessons learned. They had conversations with regulators and with industry participants from around the world. So they spoke to the FCA, they spoke to the EU Commission, they spoke to the ACCC in Australia to understand what are the things that went well and what are the things that went badly. So you'll see if you actually read 1033, as someone who's read it coming from a UK experience, there's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. And there's things like, so all of the drama around 90-day reauthentication, that concept isn't even mentioned in 1033 because the CFPB understood what happened and why it didn't go as planned in the UK market and in the EU market. So they took that lessons learned. They also, and like what we see actually in Canada, if we go to our northern neighbor, they did a very similar approach. And what they've done is they've already said, we're not just going to stop the scope at bank accounts. We're going to already include things like your credit card account. We're going to include more investment type products because they don't want to come across the issue that we now face in the UK. And the reason why we're so excited about open finance is because the scope was limited under PSD2. So you can really see these other jurisdictions that are kind of taking those lessons learned and putting them actually into practice and saying, this is how we're going to try and make sure we don't come across those same challenges and build out a platform and an open banking, open finance rule that could potentially last for more than 5 years and could hopefully last for 10 years or however the world changes. I think one country that has been really interesting to watch develop and definitely touches on the point that you just made, Nilixa, is that if we look at South Africa, and we look at more of the African continent in general. So Yodlee is actually based in South Africa. We have an office there. We have been live in the South African market since 2012, and it's been very interesting to see how those conversations are changing. But I think the biggest difference is the companies that we're traditionally working with, it's not banks. It is banks, we do work with them, but where most of the data is actually located and where a majority of the consumers are actually engaging with their financial services is through their mobile phone. So we're having a deep relationship with the likes of Vodafone and Vodacom and Safaricom and M-Pesa because that's where you actually get the movement of funds. You're getting the consumer data, which is the things that we want and that we traditionally think of when we talk about open banking and open finance. And I think that's the real shift. And it's a similar shift that Nilixa was just talking about in Asia, where the traditional way that we've seen and that we've approached it in the UK and EU, it doesn't necessarily work in some other markets. So we as fintechs have to shift the way that we're thinking about it. It also means that the regulators who are looking to introduce any open banking or open finance rule, they also have to shift in the way that they're drafting the rules because it's not the standard bank to fintech relationship. It's actually you have all these other parties that need to be included in that scope but it's harder to fit them in because look at Safaricom, it's a telecoms provider. They're not going to be regulated by any banking act. They're not going to be regulated by a financial services bank or regulator. So you really have to try and figure out that difference. And that's why I think in some of the more emerging markets, it's really mostly been market driven, and why you're still seeing a lot of prevalence of screen scraping, because where the data is and where the funds are being moved is not in that traditional bank relationship.
Interesting. Yeah, because one of the things I was going to ask about was whether emerging markets were simply kind of using the PSD2, for example, and kind of implementing it, or like a version of it in their market. Are we starting to see countries move on from that and actually, because it sounds from what you're saying, like people are adopting their own models?
Yep, so we actually saw in Nigeria, they created, I believe it's last year or the year before, they published their version of open banking regulation. They did call it open banking, but it does try to include those more traditional telecoms providers, to include them in the scope. And they did that by having a broader definition of what is data processing. So it also then kind of feeds into data protection regulation and thinking about that and how does that need to operate. So it could include things that are not the traditional bank to fintech relationship. So they managed it by kind of broadening that definition and putting, if you are processing data that is of a financial nature, you are included in this scope. So that's just one approach we've seen. We're seeing others that are trying to approach it from more defined, like, okay, are you providing an e-wallet? If you're providing an e-wallet, it doesn't matter if you're a bank or if you're any type of company, if you're providing an e-wallet to consumers, you are therefore in scope of this open banking regulation. So we're seeing people approach it in different ways. It's just taking a bit more time as they try and figure out exactly how they want to include that scope.
Interesting, and Kat, not to put you on the spot, but I'm finding this quite an interesting area to look into a bit more. When it comes to kind of moving into new jurisdictions, is it confusing kind of keeping tabs on different rules, or you find, or is it actually quite simple when it comes to kind of moving out of like just the EU and UK into other places?
It's quite difficult. This is not a purposeful plug for Vixio, but we do actually use Vixio. We specifically use the horizon scanning tool, and I find it's just incredibly useful to have a one-stop shop where I can go and see all those different types of regulation. Because like I just said, it's not just that I'm looking for payment regulation or open banking regulation. You also have to take in consideration data protection regulation, because a lot of times some of this activity falls into that scope. So you're almost monitoring multiple variations of similar things to better understand how do we actually operate. And the key thing that we're also looking at is, if I want to expand into Kenya, for example, do I need to set up a brick and mortar office, or can I just operate from my UK office? It's other things like that. And like, you have to read kind of a multiple of different pieces of regulation to better understand, how am I going to enter this new market, and how am I going to, when I enter it, actually make a success of it.
Interesting. And Jack, I don't know if you have any particular views on that.
Well, we had a stint in Australia, Truelayer, and it was a very different regime, and it didn't seem to bear much resemblance to PSD2. It was more on the data side of things, opening up consumer data, and it didn't have a payment arm to it, and it was very it was very kind of locked down in how you could access the data and process it, and there were a lot more restrictions. And for those reasons and a bunch of other reasons, we kind of didn't continue in Australia. But I do think that there are certain jurisdictions that start from scratch on these things rather than taking a lead from Europe and the UK.
So brilliant. And kind of moving on from that, it'd be great to know a bit about how in the UK and EU, or back to the UK and EU rather, how do we transition to this open finance world that we're suddenly noticing UK and EU regulators discuss? One thing that has stood out to me, or I've been following quite a lot recently, has been the feeder regulation, and of this endless debate almost of like whether the EU has kind of learnt its lessons from PSD2 in creating FIDA. Nilixa, as the chair of the Open Finance Association, I wonder if you'd be a good person to speak to about that.
Sure. Thanks for the question. feeder regulation is obviously the next step for the EU, because they've gone from the sort of, bottom-up approach of open banking, open finance. I think the challenge we have with that regulation at the moment is that it's still, I know it encompasses a lot of providers and a lot of data, but in what it can do, it's quite narrow. It's data sharing. And I think we know from the example in Australia that if you don't sort of build in all of the functionality at the start, it's very challenging for people to come in, innovate, provide competition. And I really, really think, given the process that we have in the EU of proposing legislation and, getting it through all the hoops, that they need to be more ambitious. They need to put in action initiation at the start of this process, payments and action initiation, so that in the long run, this is a piece of regulation that's going to be there for a number of years. There is that capacity to provide really innovative, user-friendly services. I think the other challenge that we face with the FIDA regulation is the distinct possibility of a lot of fragmentation. Because of the way that the regulation is drafted, with industries coming together to build out their standards, you could face a situation where you have different standards just because within a jurisdiction, just because you only need so many providers in which to formulate your own standards. And then you could have fragmentation because you'll have jurisdictional differences as well. And given the challenges we already know about cross-border in the EU, despite the fact that we're aiming for a single market, I think that could lead to barriers rather than innovation and competition. And I think those are the two key things within that regulation that we should be thinking about and addressing now for the longer term future.
Yeah, and one of the things sorry, do you want to jump in there?
I was going to say there's another risk with open finance, and I heard it referred to at a conference today of it being a mile wide and an inch deep, trying to encompass loads of different sectors and data types, and not being narrow and deep, so that you can focus on some use cases that unlock value. I think in the UK we've actually done some good work. CFIT, Centre for Innovation and Technology, has done really extensive work looking very narrowly at certain use cases. They've landed on SME lending as one of the use cases where unlocking data can actually unlock real value. So we need to do more of that. We need to do more of those deep dives. And for me, one of the first places we should start is identity. We're so close with open banking to not having to create a brand new digital identity, but being able to leverage the KYC that banks do very well on their customers. We can already reach into a bank via API and get name of the account holder and know that is verified name of the account holder. What if we could reach in through APIs to a bank and get a tokenized KYC version of their identity? That would be extremely valuable. You could build a whole commercial model around it, and it would unlock lots of progress, and it would move us away from this perennial debate about digital identity. So I'd like to see CFIT doing that kind of deep dive next.
Yeah, and I was going to ask a bit about the UK's kind of approach to open finance, I guess. Do you think that it's a better way of doing it than the EU? Because I have heard a few people express concerns about the EU, perhaps. I don't know, it seems like there could just end up being a dozen different schemes, which could be country by country or industry by industry, which could make it pretty confusing when it comes to implementing open finance. So yeah, that'd be interesting to get your views on.
It certainly feels like we're moving towards a world where the open banking implementation entity or its successor body takes on a role for open finance. It's going to be the secretariat of the Open Finance Task Force, so that's a starting point. If they they are a centre of expertise for open banking standards, for API protocols, why not make them the centre of excellence for open finance standards? That would make sense to me. But there is competition in this space. I'm sure FDX in the US would like a piece of the action in the UK. There's lots of different ways it could work.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of what the UK has released now, the consultation a few weeks ago on the future entity, it'd be great to know, is this what you guys were hoping for? I realise that it feels like we've been talking about the future funding model and governance for years now. Certainly since I've been at Vixio, it's been a kind of ongoing conversation, which has been 4 years now. So yeah, John, I don't know if I can start with you. It'd be great to know what your thoughts were on the UK's latest work on open banking and the future entity.
Yeah, of course, Jimmie. I mean, I think generally it's broadly positive. I think in terms of the funding model, there'll be a nature of complexities that they would have to iron out, but I think that was made quite clear as well in terms of the way they positioned it. I'm guessing TPPs and banks, in terms of the overall opinion on it, might vary, but to build out an infrastructure, I guess you need funding and also support. I think it will be also interesting on regulatory compliance and how they manage things while they're setting up an infrastructure themselves internally. Time and time again, see kind of internal governance and frameworks while they're being built out. How will they be able to supervise effectively?
Brilliant. And I don't know, Kat, whether you've got any views on this as an industry participant.
I definitely think it was a good next step. Initially, I was a bit shocked that they had more consultation questions because, to your point, Jimmie, we've been talking about this for a good 4 years now. So I was initially shocked that they were still asking for more industry input, but I do think the questions were very focused, and I can tell. So I actually did sit on the funding working group. That was a sub-working group of the future entity working group, which Nilixa joined me on as well. And we had a lot of conversations about funding and about governance and capabilities and all that stuff. And I can see reading that a lot of it they did actually take in, and it was clear to see that they have read it in detail, and they have then kind of clearly stated, we're going to take this forward, we're not going to take this forward. So like we are starting to see more of an actual path towards the future entity and what it will look like. But I do think it is, let's stop kicking the can down the road and let's just make a decision and actually get this future entity up and running. Because as Jack said, there are other industry bodies out there that are looking at this as an opportunity and potentially interested in expanding into this market. So we have a great opportunity right now with the future entity, and we're taking all the learnings from open banking implementation entity and putting that into something else, but we can't keep waiting. We need to actually act now.
Yeah,
I was on the stage. Sorry, Jimmie. I was just going to say, on the stage in Asia, the comment was made that Europe is great at process. And I think this would be a key example of how we've been great at process, having been through so many iterations of different consultations. And it really is imperative that we actually set the goal, set the vision, and move towards it, both with the future entity and also with the VRP work.
I have to disagree that it's been a great process. I think it's been quite.
No, I didn't say it was a great process. I just said we're good at process.
I was wondering as well, just this lack of certainty that we've had on the future of open banking in the UK, do you think that has actually limited the market? Has it meant that perhaps people aren't coming into the UK or companies aren't wanting to invest when previously they would have? Because it does seem like we've been waiting for ages to know what the future entity is going to look like.
It's held back industry in terms of OPL has been great historic at getting standards out, releasing new sets of standards that then get implemented by banks that then unlock new functionality. So without that and without funding certainty for OBL, we've had a vacuum where this continuous process of new standards should have been. So like take VRP, for example, variable recurring payments. That's not something that's moved as fast as it should have. We still don't have certainty from regulators on VRP. So even if we had a standards body, they wouldn't be able to get on with the process of publishing those standards. But it all adds to this kind of slowdown that we're experiencing in the UK.
We've definitely noticed it as well. We've seen big clients from the US who originally their roadmap for international expansion was the UK and Europe. And they saw that this lack of development, instead they prioritize actually expanding to India and Australia and putting the UK and EU at the bottom of their list. So we've definitely seen it actually in practice with individual clients who are pretty big behemoths from the US that would be really good to add to the UK and EU, and they've lost interest.
It's really interesting. That's yeah, not good at all. So hopefully the new the consultation manages to clarify everything. Just to follow up on the VRP point, I was wondering what set like clarification is needed from the regulators on that now, and what are we seeing happen in the market? Because I feel with VRPs, like I feel like I've been talking about these for a long time. They sound really exciting, but then are we actually seeing any of these things happen? Yeah, I don't feel like I am.
We've made huge progress on recurring payments with sweeping, and that's moving money between accounts in the same name. So, you know, paying off debt or putting money into savings accounts. And obviously, there's a million plus VRP payments being made at the moment. So it's not like we've stood still, but we are prevented from enabling recurring payments to businesses, and that's really the missing piece of the puzzle if we want to be able to compete properly with cards and really increase retail competition as per the payment system regulator's 5-year strategy. So the missing piece of the puzzle is to unlock the ability to enable recurring payments to businesses, and then there will be subscription use cases, bank account on file competing with card on file, you know, rental payments. All of these things will be a possibility, but one thing that the PSR has done that's not been super helpful is that, you know, it was telling industry to get on with it and to work in the commercial space, and that was happening. There were grassroots of collaboration and commercial deals between banks and TPPs, but then the payment systems regulator came with a consultation that proposed to mandate price at 0. And that really spooked the market, because, you know, if they've got commercial deals in train that are not at 0, they're worried that then they'll become non-compliant, and so it really froze the market. So I think it was an intervention that was a bit undercooked, to be honest.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to comment on that at all before I go to audience questions? No. Okay, awesome. So yeah, one of the audience questions that we have had is looking at how aligned the UK and EU are on open banking and open finance now, considering the proposals that have been introduced. I wonder, is one of the jurisdictions jumping ahead of the other at the moment? I wonder who wants to take that.
Take fraud liability. A hot topic at the moment. The UK, the first thing that it's done in terms of reforming services regulations is to totally rewrite liability rules so that APP rules can be created, and that's splitting liability between the sending and the receiving firms. In the EU, there isn't such a proposal to split liability, so that's a big divergence, and we'll see the consequences of that divergence playing out over the next couple of years.
Absolutely, and we have had actually another question come through on fraud liability, which doesn't surprise me because it is one of the topics that I keep hearing coming up at conferences at the moment, particularly the UK's version. So it's regarding confirmation of payee and how this relates to open banking in the new PSR regulation. I assume that's the UK PSR. And basically, this person has asked, is it similar to AIS and PIS, and what are the key components of open banking?
I can have a go at answering that.
Sure.
It's not the same as open banking. With open banking, a company can use AIS data to understand who they're paying. But confirmation of payee works a different way. It's not using AIS data. It's using a directory that the banks are all participants of.
I think, Jimmie, just to add, I think the regulators are missing a slight trick in helping the fight against financial crime fraud, because actually open banking payments themselves can be used in that ecosystem. Because remember, one of the biggest challenges is manipulation. And if you have been the subject of fraud, it's because you've typed in information and you're paying someone who is not who you think you're paying. But in an open banking PISP ecosystem, the payee details are populated by the PISP, who have verified the merchant, and therefore you are, immediately mitigating that risk of fraud, because you can't have manipulation of the payee.
Brilliant. And do you think at the moment there is enough awareness of that from consumers and also the government? Is there enthusiasm from the government, for example, and regulators to actually propel open banking because of that reason? Because I feel like fraud is just a constant issue at the moment in the EU and UK in particular. Like, I'm constantly writing about it.
Well, we keep saying it, the Open Finance Association, but I'm not sure it's getting much traction.
Nice, fantastic. So yeah, I feel we are kind of coming up to time now. So I wonder, final question for all of you is, put you on the spot. What market is the one to watch when it comes to open banking and open finance at the moment? Is there any in particular that's standing out to you where particularly exciting things are happening? John, should we start with you?
I think I'm going to echo what I was saying previously, but Singapore seems really exciting at the moment from what I'm reading and what the research we're doing. And then I guess a second would be the race in the UAE at the moment. I was speaking to one of the regulators last week, and they're firmly in a race to see who can be the innovator for open banking, open finance in that region.
Brilliant. And Nilixa, Fresh from Money 2020.
Oh yeah, well, I have to say I'd probably have to sit on the fence on this, because I don't think there's one clear winner. I think there's so many different approaches. And I go back to the point I made that a lot of the Asian markets are actually doing open finance. They just don't call it that.
Kat?
Everyone can probably guess my answer. For me, it's the US right now, mainly because that's going to take up my entirety of the fall. I'd definitely say the US and Canada, as they seem to be going through this process together, and at a great time they're doing it together. So, going to be very busy second half of the year, but it will be very exciting to see how the US actually tackles this.
Certainly busy for us and the editorial team as well, then. And Jack?
I'm going to stick up for the EU. It's the first market, I think, that is actually going for round 2 on open banking and seeing how it can reform the original proposals. And there's an exciting, meeting point of the instant payment regulations, which are hopefully going to result in ubiquitous instant payments in the EU with the new payment services regulations. So that's an exciting combination. It's going to take a bit of time, but hopefully it'll really help open banking in the EU.
Great. That sounds good. All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today, and also for our wonderful speakers who I feel are definitely experts in their field. I'm looking forward to covering further open banking and open finance developments this year, and certainly it will be interesting to see what happens in the UK and further afield as well. I'm now going to pass back to Jack, my colleague, and yeah, thank you so much for taking time to spend to come along today.